some extent. Okay, so um, on my blog, I gave some answers to some questions, and let me just dive into that a little bit. So, first question people ask is, how many stitches do I cast on? Do I just cast on 1 inch worth of stitches? And all I can say is, oh my God, absolutely not. Um, a swatch is to represent what your knitting is going to be, and you're not knitting over an inch. It might give you a quick snapshot of whether or not you've got the right size needles for that yarn, but it is not going to be an accurate representation of what your knitting is going to be like in a larger piece. Likewise, um, casting on 4 inches of stitches is not a good practice, except to find out if you're in the ballpark. So um, I always recommend, like, if you think you're going to get 5 stitches to the inch, cast on 30 stitches. Or if you're working a stitch pattern, the nearest multiple, but don't go down to 28, go up to 32, or whatever the next jump is. Better to have extra stitches and to spend a little extra time. Um, so why not 4 inches? I can tell you that on my knitting, that my right selvage stitch and my left selvage stitch, or the end stitches, are not the same. Um, I tension differently at the beginning and end of the row, so I don't want to include those. So that means that I have to at least have 4 inches plus. Plus, we all know that as we knit, our tension usually relaxes from those anxious few rows. And so you're really going to take your gauge in the middle. So you need enough that you have edges, and preferably like a half of an inch or an inch of edges. This is not to say that we don't all cheat, that, if you're doing 1 by 1 rib, unlikely you're going to cast on 5 inches of stitches. Um, but, at least cast on what you think 4 inches is, plus a couple of edge stitches. This is what makes it more likely to be representative, is once you've got enough stitches that it's more like working a row, and it's still just going to be a portion. Um, then the next question is, how many rows do I work? Well, you work 5 or 6 inches of rows. Um, and I love to swatch, so to me, it's just nothing to knock out a swatch, except when I'm feeling impatient. And that's when we get in trouble. We always get in trouble when we're trying to rush the process. And, therein lies the rub on swatching. Knitters don't want to swatch because it takes time. Um, they're anxious to get into their project because that's when you get that dopamine hit. Um, and so you need to kind of reframe what you're trying to get out of your swatch. And the reason I love to swatch is because for me, it's like putting together, say, cookie dough to be made later. Um, it gives me the satisfaction of kind of interacting with my knitting, which I want to do, um, without jumping in and committing myself to doing the whole thing. So I frequently make cookie dough, put it in the fridge for a while, and then I sometimes just bake pans at a time. Um, and I do believe that it makes your cookies better if the dough sits in the in the refrigerator, and I haven't found exactly the perfect temperature to bring the dough to get the best cookie melting. So if you take it right out of the refrigerator and make your cookies and throw it in the oven, it's a little too cold. Um, but if you wait too long, um, then it's back to room temperature. So I would say probably you need to wait a half an hour or an hour after you've taken your dough out of the fridge. But I rarely do that because the moment I decide I need cookies, I'm going to throw those puppies in the oven. Um, so that's what we do with our swatches is we get excited, we want the cookie, and so we either don't do enough knitting to become comfortable with our yarn, our needles, the stitch pattern, or um, we don't then do kind of the post swatch treatment that's going to really tell you what you need to know. Um, so I have more than once explained my ritual for swatches, and occasionally I get excited and forget the middle stage, but which means that then I have to make a second swatch. Um, so I make my swatch when after I cast on and get going, I tie knots. Hi, Wendy. In the yarn tail, so I know what size needle I was using, and I use US sizes because um, I can tie a 4 or 5 or a 3. Um, it's tricky later on to figure out, like if you put 2.75. So, I will tie 2 and then leave some space and tie 3 to represent 0.75. But I have to kind of remember that I did that. And I should write everything down, but I don't. So, and then if I change needle size, I tie on another tail and tie the number in, or I tie it in the cast off so that I have all that information. And then one of the things that I do, you do as a machine knitter. So when your stitches are on the needle bed, they are pulled horizontally. And so when you finish your knitting or your swatch, you like pull it and pull it and pull it so that you're getting those stitches to relax. So I tend to do that just because it's fun. And then I usually throw it onto the chair that sits next to the couch and pick it up the next day. And in my office, I trace around my swatch in pencil, um, and just kind of a loose, it doesn't have to be perfect, but kind of so I have some representation of what that end block swatch looked like. Then I throw it into the sink in the bathroom, and with a little detergent, um, I happen to use Unicorn's fiber wash, whatever you like. Um, and I always say I leave it in for 20 minutes or whenever I remember that it's there, and sometimes it can be several hours. Um, and the fiber wash you have to rinse. So I rinse my swatch and then I roll it in a towel and step on it to get out all the water. And I throw it over a empty towel rack in the bathroom and let it dry. And we live someplace where things dry pretty quickly, um, summer, winter. So, it might only need 3 or 4 um, I just realized that I'd written something and hadn't hit send. It may only need 3 or 4 hours, but I usually leave it overnight. And then the next day, I take it down to my laundry room and I put it the swatch face down on the counter, which is white formica, and I plug in my Swatch iron, which is just an iron that's always, relatively inexpensive one. I've got it cranked up to highest setting. I keep it filled with water. I plug it in. When it heats up, I then steam my swatch without touching it with the iron, although I have been caught actually using the point of the iron to rule out the edges. Um, but certainly be careful if you're using anything non-natural when you do that, because you don't want to melt anything. And so what I'm doing is I've got the iron set to steam, and it's just like shooting steam into the fabric and onto the counter. So I end up with like a little puddle of water that the swatch is sitting in, and I then like poke it into the shape that it should be in if it's gotten distorted at all. Unplug my iron, most important thing, and then I leave it for at least 3 hours. So if I do that at 7 in the morning ish, when I get up, it means that I can probably take the final gauge by around lunchtime, if I'm so inclined. So that way, the yarn has been, stressed by water. It's dried out. It's allowed the yarn to bloom if it's going to, and um, then I do the steaming, which just kind of sets all the stitches. And you'll notice that I never said that I pin anything out. So I'm just letting the yarn do what the yarn wants to do. And once it's dried, I take it upstairs to um, the same piece of paper that I had drawn the outline on before. And I trace around the swatch again, but this time I use colored ink. Um, and I take the gauge. I think earlier I said I forgot to say that I take the unblock gauge and write it down on that piece of paper. So I might, write like 24 stitches and 32 rows. And then I do the same thing again using my ink so I know which is which. And I usually figure it out for 4 inches just because I like to do the math. So now I've got the information that I'm going to use to create my pattern and to knit from. So the project I'm working on right now, the um, the row gauge actually compresses when it's washed. So I know that what I'm knitting is actually longer than what it's going to be. I'd say, frequently it's the opposite, that it's actually shorter than it's going to be when the yarn relaxes. Um, but I've got the blocked gauge and the unblock gauge to compare so that I can see what's actually happening. And then I write my pattern based on the numbers in those swatches. So I need to make sure that those numbers are good. Um, and if I have my sample knit by somebody else, they're probably going to have a slightly different row gauge. So then we have to decide, do we knit to pattern repeat ends, or do we knit to the number of rows? So I tend to like divide my armholes at the end of a repeat of rows. And so then I have to decide like what adjustments do I make. It's going to be really crucial on the front neckline. Um, So that's how I swatch, and I realize that it's kind of crazy and excessive, except that I like my things to fit. Um, so other reasons to swatch would be, um, like if you're doing color work, that you want to see how the colors interact. And we all know that when you use something as your primary color, um, it it impacts. So sometimes you end up switching. Um, I've got some. I don't actually do color work because it makes me nuts, but I'm knitting something that slip stitches. And it's kind of a muddle on this camera, but I had to figure out how I wanted to do the color switches, which I'm doing because I only had one skein of the multicolored yarn. And it was an opportunity to get rid of two other yarns that I wanted to get rid of. So, observing color is a really good um, reason to do it. I find that, like for trims, sometimes seeing what it's going to look like is really important to deciding how deep I want the trim, around the neck or at the cuffs or at the bottom. Um, so observation is just a really important thing. Um, I like to practice my stitch pattern before I do it in a larger piece. And so if you only block in stockinette, and let's say you're doing something more complex, your gauge is going to change. So you need to always swatch in pattern. Um, but for me, the main reason to do that is that means by the time I'm ready to knit my piece, I usually have the stitch pattern memorized and I don't have to slavishly follow along. Um, the other things that you can observe is the weight of the fabric, how it's going to drape, um, and the density. And sometimes all you need to do is change your needle size to change one of those things. Um, but I always like to know. And it's one of the reasons I do trim, because you need to know, do you go down one needle size or two or something else? And then the other, to me, one of the most crucial things, if I'm going to be doing the knitting, is, do I like working that stitch pattern? Because sometimes I don't. Like I just said, color work makes me want to put my eyes out. So I might do like a tiny bit of color work in something, but beyond a hat, I can't do it. So I need to know that I like doing it. I like to figure out whether it's something that knitters are going to like to do. So I learned early on that knitters tend to not like things where, you're like increasing three stitches, decreasing three stitches, like a bramble stitch or something. Not really popular. So I don't do those, because if nobody's going to enjoy doing it, I might do it in a hat. Okay, so those are my why swatch reasons. And so then I'd like to segue. Can anybody say anything? I've never done this before. Um, so I think you can write me a message if you want to ask me something. Um, I never did figure out how to get people. I think people could only ask me questions by writing or asking to be invited to be live with me, but I don't want to do that. So write me a question if you've got one. Um, Otherwise, I will just continue to talk for another 10 minutes. So, one of the things that I have found over the years of writing patterns, um, is that there are a lot of obstacles in patterns that are unintentional. And, so created by the person writing the pattern, or, I mean, none of us do it intentionally, but they just crop up. They're things that like make knitters crazy. And I think we all need to always be remembering that people, when they sit down to knit, just want to knit. I mean, I just want to knit. At night, I don't want to be like sorting out different things. So, um, again, swatching can kind of raise awareness of some possible issues. So when I do a swatch for a garment, I would never do this for an accessory, but I will do like a neckline, and I'll do the shaping. I'll do the bind off. I'll do some shaping. I even do like a short rope shoulder. Um, and then I can pick up and put trim in that, if that's going to be a component of the garment. I have started with a length of the trim stitch. And let's say I'm doing seed stitch. I will do, I swear to God, 3 to 4 inches of seed stitch before I go into the larger body part of the swatch. So I know I'm cheating. I'm not doing 4 to 5, 5 to 6 inches of trim, but I just figure nobody's ever going to do that. So why should I? And then I figure out how many rows there would be if I had done 4 inches based on my, let's say, 3 inch gauge numbers. It's not perfect, but I figure that if I said that someone had to do 4 inches of 1 by 1 rib or seed stitch, they would just throw the pattern aside and not swatch at all. So I like to swatch within that curve for my trim, because then I can see, um, like how many stitches I can put into that curve and still have it be flat and not wavy or stretched on the inside of the curve. So that's really important to me. If it was a V-neck, I would do a V-neck. I tend not to do V-necks, so usually it's a curve. So other obstacles are someone can't execute the decrease, or if you say make one, um, they're going to literally do the pull up the thread between the two stitches, and that may not be the best method. So I always like to practice all of my different shaping stitches. And I think if knitters do that, then you don't get into a situation where you look at one side of your neckline and say, "Oh my God, my knit two together doesn't look at all like my SSK." Um, and I believe I started this talking about, like, if the knitter's row gauge is different. So if the knitter's row gauge is different, they have to make some judgments. And everything on my patterns is done to blocked gauge. So they're not measuring. They have to figure out how many rows that is. And if they haven't done that, then you might get to, like, you're in the middle of a cable when you need to divide, and that isn't what the pattern intended. The pattern intended for you to cross those stitches and divide right there, and not where it's relaxed. So we can unintentionally put obstacles into a pattern that are going to make the knitter put something aside. Big one, reverse shaping. If you say reverse shaping, not everyone can do that on the fly. So they may have to sit down and figure it out. That's going to make them put it down. And then the project usually becomes an unfinished project. Um, so I think that on both sides, so on my side from the writing and from the knitter's side, that doing a swatch can really save you a lot of the aggravation and frustration further down the road. Now we are not accustomed to being good to our future selves. We want to get that dopamine hit and move on. So you have to kind of talk yourself into why doing a swatch is so much fun and why it's so good. So I know Reen Gill has posted recently about her swatch gauge not being correct on a garment that she was making. And so that will sometimes happen. If you are not kind of in the proper state of mind when you do your swatch, which is if you're just doing it and you're frustrated that you have to do it and you're not trying to get good information from it, i.e., give it enough time to make it properly. Your tension's not going to be the same as it is once you get into the project. And then your sweater will be wrong. So if you have a sense once you get into your project that it's not going quite right, we always have that sense. Listening to it is really, really hard. Stop after you're like 4 inches in, put it onto waste yarn or cord, block it, and see what your gauge is. And if it's different, at least you're only 4 inches in. We've all been there where it turns out that it just, the whole environment in making it was different, and whether it's too small or too large, it will never get better. That's my best advice. And if you're going to work in the round, I recommend doing an I-cord swatch, which is where you just pull the yarn across the back so you're always working a right side row. And that will mimic your in the round knitting as best you can in a swatch. So then it's important that you use the same needle. I used to do all of my swatches on wooden double points, and it worked out fine. But I decided that I wouldn't do that anymore because I never recommend it to other people. So use the needles you're going to use. And the reason you should do, unless you're going to be doing magic loop, your magic loop gauge won't be accurate for a larger piece, which is also why I don't believe in using a sleeve for a gauge swatch, because they're just different. You're increasing a lot quickly, and they tend to be smaller number of stitches, and they just may not be representative, especially if you do it at the beginning. So when you get to your sleeve, if you've done the body, your body, your tension will be fine because you've already done all of that. Whew. So I think that's it on swatches. They are crucial. They are your friend. you do need to do a lot more stitches than you probably want to do. Oh, I know the last thing. What do you do with your swatches? People always ask me this. So I have hundreds of swatches, and um, I go through them and cull them occasionally. So I keep things that like I'm interested in the stitch pattern still. Um, it's a project that I'm doing more than one piece on. I will keep the swatches. If I think there's anything educational, I will keep the swatch. I love to swatch, but I don't really want to do it again. Um, and if it's a yarn I use over and over again, I will keep the swatch because I can glean a lot of information from it. So one year I did yarn reviews for Anzula, and so I have, and it was probably more like 18 months, I probably have 18 to 24 swatches in their yarn. And these I knit like 50-gram swatches. Um, so I have all of those. And if I am using one of their yarns, I can go and get information to extrapolate from before I do my actual swatch for that project. Um, I throw things out that um, I'm always getting swatches back from knitters, and sometimes we need the yarn, but normally I throw those out because they aren't my knitting. Um, and things I'm just not interested in, I throw out. But like, I would never make a blanket out of my swatches. I would never make a blanket, period. So that's just not the kind of thing that I do. Doesn't interest me. So do whatever you want with your swatches. I am totally not above taking my swatch out so I can reuse the yarn. I always am taking projects out that aren't going right and reusing the yarn. So I wind it into hanks and wash it, and usually I steam it to try and get as many of the kinks out of it as I can. So, and also so so that we're not bringing the bad juju from the unfinished project into the next one. Um, so if I need the yarn to finish trim or whatever, I will take out my swatch. The swatch is close to having done its job at that point. So I really don't have a lot. I've not done a ton of knitting here. I've actually done quite a bit of knitting on this piece. Oops, looks like something came off the needles there. And so this whole side of the front, that's the armhole, the neckline. I think I started the seed stitch too low, so I'm going to rip it back and redo it with more of the, I call this barrel lace, don't ask me why. It's a Japanese knitting stitch pattern, so it doesn't have a name. But I started the buttonholes like an inch into the seed stitch, and I need to start it at the same place. So, but I've knit this like 3 times now because I keep not really liking what I've done. And it's probably because I am not used to doing two or three colors. But I like the overall shape. In fact, this afternoon I was thinking, I wonder if I made the body too long. So I took this off and I did block it, but I haven't steam blocked it. And I kind of didn't want it to be too long, but this is probably just the first sample. I'll probably do another one that doesn't involve all these changes. And so the reason I don't do color work is I can't manage more than one ball of yarn at a time. So I'm constantly like unwrapping things. I don't know how people stand to do it. Anyhow, it's 4:51. It's Friday. It's Valentine's Day. I'm sure that most people had other things to do. So we will see whether I get access to this so that I cut out all the ums and pauses and things like that. So it's a little bit more concise if you want to rewatch it. But please let me know how you feel about swatching. Have a good weekend. Bye.